said the train is coming, baby. I said the train is coming now. I said the train is coming, baby. I said the train is coming now. So long I've been waiting for you. Oh yeah. Now the time has come when it's between me and you. Oh Lord.
Bonjour, ici Alan Rock, recteur de l'Université d'Ottawa, l'Université canadienne. Hello, this is Alan Rock, president of the University of Ottawa, Canada's university. Composez le numéro du poste que vous voulez joindre maintenant ou demeurer en ligne. Enter the extension number you wish to reach now or stay on the line.
Hey, it's time for the 5 o'clock train. I'm your host, and I will explain. I'm now the co-host, co-producer of this show. This is the 5 o'clock train every Thursday from 5 to 6. And we're going to announce a new direction of the show. And we have on the line, by remote technology, far away and so on, Joshua Blakeney. Are you there, Joshua?
Pleased to be with you, Professor.
It's really, it's going to be a lot of fun because we've decided, I just did a media interview this morning when someone asked me for television, how do you make your media, your independent media, relevant? And one of the answers is make it more radical. Go to the root of problems. Go to the root of things. And in that sense, in that light, I wanted us to team up, and you're now going to be the co-producer at large, and we're going to talk about things that are just unheard of on the FM waves here in Ottawa's capital in particular. So welcome to the show, and we're going to be talking about things like, the taboo subjects in terms of the mainstream media, Iran, Canada's relationship to Iran, wars in the Middle East, and so on, and we're gonna speak truth about those questions. So I'm really happy that we're going to do this, and you're a perfect person to be the anchor for this kind of thing because of your extraordinary independent journalism, and your research and your breadth and bravery as well in terms of putting these things out there, but also in relation to Canadian society. I mean, you are an incredible resource, and I think that Ottawa needs to hear about your work and needs to benefit from you and your contacts and the incredible people that you've been in touch with, that you've interviewed. That's what we're going to bring to the show from now on.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to participating in this journey with you, Professor Rancourt. And of course, the respect that you just imparted to me is mutual because, of course, you have been indefatigably standing up to some of the bullies, some of those who seek to assert their hegemony over the city of Ottawa. You've been single-handedly, it seems, standing up to them in your legal battles. And so hopefully I can be in a position to pick your brain on the air so people might, benefit from hearing some of the insights that you might not have provided in previous shows. And I've listened to some of your shows before where you haven't had a guest and you've gone solo, and they've been highly incisive. And so I'm very much looking forward to collaborating with you as your co-host on the train and hoping to bring truth to the citizens of Ottawa. Of course, we've seen recently the Canadian government make the decision that they're going to sever ties with the important country on the globe of Iran to kick out the Iranian ambassador from Ottawa. Of course, during the Cold War, at the height of the tensions between the Soviet Union and the capitalist world, the Canadian government retained a Soviet embassy in Ottawa. And so obviously it's a significant step. And so I think that's the kind of subject that needs to be addressed, needs to be deconstructed. And it's so great that we have this platform to pursue that end.
Well, I'm glad that you introduced this question of the Iranian embassy here in Ottawa. I mean, it was shocking and outrageous when the government announced that they would just close it. It was just unbelievable. And it was also interesting to see how Harper announced it. I mean, here's this man who is normally silent on every issue of public concern. He doesn't like the media, doesn't cooperate with regards to openness and frankness. But on this question, he was very vocal, and he had this prepared speech both in French and in English, and he was explaining in quotations, because it's ridiculous what he was saying. It was not an explanation at all. It's the opposite of logic. I mean, we have tensions with this country, we have disagreements, so we're going to cut off all communications. That's insane.
Well, one of the key claims of the Canadian government was that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, my friend and colleague, Professor Kevin Barrett, who of course was expelled from his professorial role because he decided to dedicate a week in his Islam and culture class to what did and did not happen on 9/11, and allow his students to read the scholarship of people like David Ray Griffin and so on. So he, like you, found himself expunged from his professorial role for political reasons. Professor Barrett, in his text, Questioning the War on Terror, demonstrates that actually in North America, you're more likely to die in the bathtub or from lightning than from terrorism. And so if the Iranian government is a state sponsor of terrorism, it's a form of terrorism that poses a less statistically significant threat to Canadians than bathtubs or lightning.
Well, I'd like to just stress that I think the numbers are clearly on your side. I mean, bathtub accident, like home accident deaths regarding slipping and falling and so on, it's a large number compared to the deaths from terrorism in Canada. I mean, how many deaths from terrorism can you have, or have we had in the last 30 or 50 years? But, home accidents are common killers. So, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, but I suspect that they're an order of magnitude or more, several orders of magnitude different. That's what I would think.
Yes, then you include smoking and the shortcomings of the healthcare system, how people might be dying from cancers that could be cured or deferred, were more investment put into that. And so, yeah, definitely the pretext that have been provided by the Canadian government, particularly by John Baird, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to justify this overzealous ostracism towards Iran, seems to be fictitious, seems to be fanciful, seems not to be based on the facts, but based on political rhetoric.
Yeah, I think it's even I would say it's misleading to compare it to cancer, because cancer is a major killer. Cancer, heart disease, and so on. These are major killers. But who are the people who are killed by terrorism in Canada? When did that last happen unambiguously? And what are we talking about?
Yes, and not in recent history. And of course, some would say that, I'm sure some in the government would say that the deaths of 26 Canadians on 9/11 would justify belligerence towards the Islamic world, even though there's no evidence that Iran had any complicity in 9/11. Of course, there's a lot of evidence that political actors based in the United States, in Washington, and based in Israel on the Likudnik right and in the Israeli Mossad did have complicity in the events of 9/11, which is kind of ironic when one considers the fact that it's quite obvious that the Canadian government is pursuing a foreign policy that's favorable to the state of Israel, which some would allege is, of course, the biggest state terrorist in the Middle East. We all saw the scenes of, Israel dropping white phosphorus gas on the Gaza ghetto a couple of years back. I believe just yesterday, Israel fired some kind of missile at a police car and killed 3 policemen. One of my Facebook contacts who lives in Gaza updated her status and said, these are fathers who have children, and they were blown to smithereens by the Israeli government yesterday. Of course, that wasn't in the Canadian media because they're too busy talking about the alleged repression of the Assad government in Syria. And so I think it's quite obvious that there's a very powerful pro-Israel lobby in Canada who's, like their counterparts in the United States, are seeking to try and portray threats posed to Israel, which are often real threats to Israel, as being the same threats or posing an equal threat to Canadians or to the citizens of the United States. I would say one of the main, the raison d'etre of the neoconservatives has been to try and make people in North America, in Britain, in France, and so on, view the world through Israel's spectacles, perceive a threat from Israel's enemies when one doesn't actually exist. You could make a case, for example, that the resistance of the south of Lebanon, which often operate under the rubric of the Hezbollah, do pose some kind of threat to Israel. You could make a case that Iran does pose some kind of threat to Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. You could argue that Hamas does pose some kind of threat to Israeli hegemony over historic Palestine. But that these actors pose a threat to Canadians isn't borne out by the facts. And so you have a relentless media campaign to try and portray those threats to Israel as being a commensurate threat to Canadians, when actually that isn't the case. And the question becomes, why is our media being so obsessively involved in demonizing another state's enemies? You know, Israel calls itself part of the West, and indeed I uncovered a book when I was doing my graduate studies at the University of Lethbridge entitled "Terrorism: How the West Can Win," edited by Benjamin Netanyahu himself in 1986, in which, that's the year I was born, incidentally, Netanyahu was calling for a war on something called international terrorism. Now, you could make a case that Israel has a problem with what you might call localized terrorism or localized acts of violent resistance, but that there's a problem with something called international terrorism that has to be combated by all Western states is actually an illusion. And so I think that's really the world we're living in. And so whereas in the Cold War, the Soviet Union was an actual enemy to some extent, an actual tangible foe of the capitalist world, Iran isn't an enemy, which is why we see the kinds of stunts that we've been seeing time and time again. You know, constantly they're announcing escalation of the sanctions or cutting of ties with Iran and so on, because they have to do political theater in order to perpetuate the myth that Iran poses some kind of threat to Canadians when in fact it doesn't. Of course, these sanctions are inflicting cruel and unusual punishment upon the people of Iran, which I can speak more about later on.
Yeah, I mean, 80 million is the population. It's a large country. Didn't Harper say something to the effect that Iran was the largest threat to world peace? Something along those lines. Did he utter these kinds of words?
Yes. The allegation was made, I think, by John Baird and Prime Minister Harper that Iran is the biggest threat to world stability and so on. And so many would draw attention to the fact that, in fact, the opposite is true, that Israel, obviously has this kind of network of what some have called Sayanim, or kind of agents of Israel operating in Western countries who are seeking to steer traditionally more peaceful countries like Canada in a pro-war direction in order to have Western states smash up the Middle East and allow their soldiers to be used as cannon fodder for a policy which is effectively seeking to foment sectarianism and civil war in the Middle East. So Arabs and Muslims and other ethnic groups in the Middle East are fighting each other rather than unifying to fight what they would view as the Israeli cuckoo in the nest. And so, obviously, pan-Arabism was the anathema to Zionist hegemony in the Middle East. The idea of the people of the Middle East uniting in order to resist imperialism and colonialism was intolerable from the perspective of the Zionists. And they knew that from day one, which is why there's always been a kind of expansionist agenda. And with the rise of the Likud party, which first came to power in 1977 under the auspices of Menachem Begin, we saw a marked deviation from a policy pursued by the Labour Zionists in Israel, which was one of being a bit more pragmatic and even considering the possibility of some rapprochement with its foes in the Middle East, to an assumption that there is no possibility for peace in the Middle East, and that the Arabs, to use the Israeli cliche, only understand force. And so that's what we've seen happen. Israel swung to the right. Some have compared it to kind of Alabama at the height of the civil rights movement, where you have polarization and so on, and some very inhospitable attitudes toward the Arab population, who of course are the majority. Now, Iran is clearly the most egregious threat to Israeli hegemony, because since 1979, Iran has forged its own path, an independent path, and whereas many Arab states commit treachery, and treason and sell out the Palestinians. The Iranian government refused to sell out the Palestinians, and indeed they send many resources. Many Palestinians would be empty-stomached if it wasn't for Iranian sponsorship and Iranian charity, philanthropy towards the Palestinian people. And so that's basically the crime of the Iranian government primarily, is standing up to imperialism, refusing to recognize Israel until it ceases to be an apartheid state. Iran's policy towards Israel is a replica of its policy towards apartheid South Africa. They refuse to recognize the government of South Africa until it ceased to be an apartheid state. And they said, look, we could maybe one day down the line consider recognizing some kind of Jewish state with a Jewish government, but we're not going to recognize you while you're an apartheid state. And so I think a convincing case could be made that Iran has a more moral foreign policy than Canada right now. Canada, of course, is blindly, one-sidedly apologetic for Israel, even when Israel is being internationally condemned all around the world by notable figures like Desmond Tutu and other Nelson Mandela and other people in the world who recognize that Israel is a periodic violator of human rights. John Baird, I've watched so many YouTubes of John Baird speaking. He has sort of the same cliches he uses over and over again, and he asserts that Canada's foreign policy is motivated with two bases. One is a consideration of what is in the Canadian national interest, and one is a consideration of human rights in the Middle East. Now, this seems to be belied by the fact that it continuously, unrelentingly acts as a kind of embassy for the Israeli government, even though that alienates and estranges and makes angry significant swathes of the populace of the Middle East. Moreover, just yesterday, John Baird announced that he was signing nuclear agreements with the United Arab Emirates. And so it's quite funny that Iran's alleged nuclear program, even though the Iranian government has a good track record of denouncing nuclear weapons and only seeks to develop nuclear power like France and Canada and other countries have, while Iran's nuclear program is held up as a pretext or a justification for cruel and unusual punishment being inflicted via the sanctions upon the people of Iran, John Baird then has the aplomb to fly into the United Arab Emirates with their highly undemocratic regime that violates human rights and sign agreements to send uranium to that country in order to help them develop nuclear power. Why can he be so sure, for example, that the UAE won't weaponize? Because once you get to the level of being able to use nuclear energy, it's very easy, I gather, to take the next step to weaponize. And so why are they so certain that Iran will weaponize, even though there's no evidence that they will? And why are they so sure that the United Arab Emirates won't weaponize? Adding insult to injury, we have to realize that Israel, which has never signed a non-proliferation treaty like Iran has, of course, hundreds of nuclear weapons. And we know that the United States and Britain and Israel are seeking to blur the boundaries in terms of international law when it comes to using weapons that may contain, for example, enriched uranium. Professor Christopher Busby went to Fallujah, and this was a significant study that he conducted, where he found in the hair samples of parents in Fallujah who were giving birth to deformed babies, he found evidence of enriched uranium, which means not only are they using DU, depleted uranium, they must be using some kind of, according to this distinguished professor, Professor Chris Busby, who has a European Union recognized entity that critically analyzes the use of nuclear power. Professor Christopher Busby claims that some kind of nuclear weapons have been being used in Iraq. And we also have a good reason to believe that such weapons have been tested in the Gaza laboratory. And so, obviously, this is cant and hypocrisy that behooves Canadians to question why our government is being so tendentiously favorable towards Israel and the UAE, Arabia, and so on, and then against countries like Iran and Syria. And Libya, it's a complete double standard, is it not?
Yeah, this question of enriched uranium, I don't know, as a scientist, that all that means is that the isotopic ratio of the uranium that was tested was not the natural ratio of isotopes of uranium in the sample that was tested. That's all that means. Of course, it's insane that they're making weapons using uranium as the as the active ingredient in the bomb, basically. So that's crazy in itself, because it continues to be radioactive. It forms all this dust that's extremely toxic. The whole depleted uranium warring is criminal. But we have to be careful also not to use these words out of proportion, if you see what I mean. But that's just me trying to make sense of it all. But I want to come back to some of the things that are being said here in Canada. Here you have a prime minister saying the largest threat to world peace is Iran. What strikes me in a statement like that is that he can say that and he's not laughed out of town. He can say that and people go, I guess that makes some kind of sense if he says so. But it's just crazy, because if you actually look at the facts, where are there wars? And who is making war? And when was the last time Iran made war? And, what are the conditions that are such that you get war? You could make a case that you get war in the present world with powerful empires like the U.S. and so on. You get war where you have weak countries that can be easily taken over in order to steal their resources. Those are conditions where you're going to get war, because they're going to find some pretext. If your country happens to be in a geopolitical place where they want to control the territory and you have resources, there's a chance you'll get war there. The way to stop that war would be to make these countries not so vulnerable. You could argue that it would be a good thing to have for Iran to have nuclear weapons, because it would create exactly the same argument that the American elite strategists were using in the Cold War, that we need nuclear weapons because it ensures that we don't have war if the two sides have them. You could argue the same thing. Would they even think of attacking Iran? And Iran, of course, would never attack Israel, because they'd be blown off the surface of the earth. And everybody understands this, especially Iranians. But wouldn't it create some kind of balance if you had equal forces like that? You could go in that direction. Yeah.
That argument has been made, most notably by Professor John Mearsheimer, who's one of the foremost international relations scholars at the University of Chicago. He says, quite frankly, that if he was the Iranian government, he would have weaponized by now and tried their best to get a nuclear weapon. And as you just accurately stated, even if Iran had a nuclear weapon, they could never use it on Israel, because Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons, and the United States has thousands of nuclear weapons, and thus
it would be a deterrent, because there's a chance their weapon could be delivered, and even one such delivery would be a significant deterrent. That's the idea, right? It's that it would be a deterrent.
Yes, and so we do have to question whether it's some kind of Eurocentric exceptionalism or racism, where it's decided that Israel not only can have nuclear weapons, it doesn't have to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it can not be criticized in our media for having gone ahead and created those nuclear weapons. I gather John F. Kennedy was actually very angry about the creation of Dimona, the Israeli nuclear facility. Just before he died, actually, he was critically investigating and seeking to prevent Israel from getting nuclear weapons, which led Ben-Gurion to resign from his premiership, I gather. But anyway, that's just a side note. But the situation is obvious that Iran already is not a broken-backed and dilapidated country like Saddam Hussein's Iraq was.
Right.
And indeed, the sanctions upon Iraq led it to be a broken-backed and dilapidated country. And surprise, surprise, they're now visiting sanctions upon the people of Iran. I view many, articles being written by Iranian journalists. One of them, Hamid Emadi, recently wrote about how his father was forced to fight in this bloody war, the Iran-Iraq war, as a result of Western governments egging on Saddam Hussein to invade Iran, because, of course, Iran itself hasn't invaded a country for over 300 years. It's got a pretty good track record. Of course, Canada has invaded Afghanistan, attacked Afghanistan, and according to Gideon Polier of the Australian National University, his study deduced that 4.5 million Afghans extra would be alive today had that unlawful assault upon the people of Afghanistan not been pursued. And so the Iranians, of course, are looking at Canada, lecturing them on human rights and on its foreign policy at a time where Canada's been waging wars against Arabs and Muslims. Of course, it led the crusade against the Libyan government recently. It was a Canadian general who led that war, that attack on Libya recently. And so obviously, Iran, this journalist, Mr. Emadi, had written about how his father had come back from that brutal Iran-Iraq war with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the title of his article, people can find it, is The Sanctions Are Killing My Father. And it's actually led him to be invited on Rush Today, this Iranian journalist. And he was saying how the sanctions are now denying his father the necessary medicine to keep him alive and keep him compos mentis, which is going to lead his father to die. And so currently the Iranian people, having never lifted a finger to threaten Canadians, having sanctions, and of course it seems there's some kind of competition between the United States, Australia, Britain, France, Canada, to kind of compete to see who can be more Israeli than the Israelis in terms of pursuing what I would say is largely a Zionist foreign policy of prioritizing the ability for Israel to retain hegemony in the Middle East. But these sanctions are killing people in Iran, and they will continue to kill people. And it's not going to endear Canada to the Iranian people. It's not going to make the Iranian people like us. It's not going to make the broader Muslim world, many of whom actually really like the Iranian government because it appears to stand up for the rights of at least the Shia half of the Muslim world, but many Muslims, including the protesters in Bahrain and so on, which the Canadian media invariably negates, we see Iran standing up for. And so in the context of the Middle East, it would seem wiser from a Canadian national interest for them to try to at least have some kind of rapprochement. No one's saying they have to genuflect to the Iranian government, but it strikes me it would be wiser for Canada to align itself more with Iran whilst distancing itself from Israel, because you have to look at, just yesterday, right? So Israel killed 3 Palestinians. Can you imagine if Iran had killed 3 Israelis yesterday, or what the news would be like? And it does indicate that the blood of people from the Middle East that are not citizens of Israel is valued as less than the blood of Israelis.
Well, on this question of blood and war, I mean, here we are in Ottawa on the FM waves. I'm with Joshua Blakeney, and we're talking about war as though it were just another word. But I mean, if we were in Ottawa now, and let's say a foreign military power decided to invade Canada or part of Canada, let's say Ottawa, and it was like what Israel did to southern Lebanon recently, in recent years, it would be just all these planes and bombs coming down, destroying every single bridge in Ottawa, every single major building, the Parliament buildings, all the infrastructure, the electric power utilities plants, the water refining plants, purifying plants, every major utility that you can see from a satellite picture, all the targets would have been pre-selected. And within, the first hours and then weeks of continuous bombing, they would just be taking everything out. And then you would, and then after that, well, you pick it up and start life again. If you can repel the enemy enough. Now in southern Lebanon, they were able to have anti-tank rockets, so they kept the tanks out, and it was somewhat of a surprise to Israel at that time that they could defend themselves to that extent. And apparently, this has changed Israeli foreign policy thinking in terms of just easily being able to take territory like that. But imagine what it would be in Ottawa if this kind of thing happened.
Yes. Well, I also have a thesis as to why the Canadian government is so close to Israel. And that stems from my realization, of course, that Israel is seeking to foment sectarianism and balkanize the Middle East, reorder the Middle East ensembles into a kind of micro-state. As the Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire reduced the Middle East into ethno-religious statelets, which was, of course, conducive to divide and rule. And, if Israel does achieve that goal, and they've achieved it to some extent in Iraq They're doing it now in Syria with their sponsorship of the sectarian groups that are fomenting civil war in Syria. If they achieve that, that's going to actually jeopardize the oil interests of oil companies in the Middle East. And it's quite evident that if you read the scholarship of Israeli scholars and of Israel's supporters in the North American media, that they resent the U.S. being dependent on Middle East oil. They don't like the U.S. sending petrodollars to Arab strongmen or to Iran. I mean, it would be Japan still buys its oil from Iran. China's buying oil from Iran. India's buying oil from Iran. But it's obvious that at least because there's obviously a lot more supporters of Israel living in North America, they've been working tirelessly to see the U.S. Employ what they would call a moral foreign policy and stop buying oil from the Middle East and giving petrodollars to Israel's enemies. Of course, Saddam Hussein fired Scud missiles at Tel Aviv in 1991. I went to Tel Aviv before and I saw these monuments from these missiles that Saddam had rained down on Tel Aviv. He was, of course, subsidizing the families of people who had done suicide bombing and so on. And so that's a good example of where you had the kind of big oil faction of the ruling class in the United States keen to despoil the resources of Iraq and were happy to prop up Saddam Hussein and disregard the national interests of Israel to some extent. But the neoconservatives definitely represent the trumping of or the superseding of the kind of pro-Israel faction of the ruling class in the United States over the interests of oil. And so Canada comes into play because the United States needs oil, and an influential faction of the ruling class are kind of more interested in Israel and seeing Middle East leaders be denied precious oil revenues. And so in comes Canada, where you can have the United States consuming oil from Canada, from Alberta, and that allows the United States to stop sponsoring what Israel would say are its enemies. And indeed, Mitt Romney just came out and made the presidential pledge, if he's elected,
isn't it more than that, though, in the sense that, I mean, it's not enough for the U.S. to stop buying Middle East or Iranian oil. They also have to ensure that the situations are such that no one can buy it. And then they continue to be supplied from Canada. I mean, that's a big part of it, right? I mean, a lot of this geopolitical thinking is to be able to encase China from receiving oil resources from Russia and elsewhere and so on, in terms of militarily controlling those regions. So it's more than just the U.S. not wanting to send its dollars to certain places. They also don't want others to have that oil. They want to control oil supplies, I think, to be able to control oil supplies through the transportation routes and so on. I don't know. I'm throwing it out there, you know?
Yeah, I think the U.S. is up to all kinds of things. But as far as Canada is concerned, it's certain to me that its role is, as it's been historically, being a kind of junior partner in imperialism. Yeah. And its role at the moment is to go around the world and entice China and also the United States and other governments to purchase Canadian oil. At the moment, it's official that Canada has the third largest oil reserves in the world. Some say it could possibly be the largest oil reserves in the world. Either way, it seems that Canada's role is to try and
okay. So you're thinking of a strategy whereby they want to dry up the funds coming into Middle East oil producing countries by using Canada. That's the idea here.
Well, if you don't believe me, just read Ezra Levant's Ethical Oil, because Ezra Levant is obviously someone who's highly partisan to Israel, spends much of his time demonizing Israel's enemies in the Canadian media, and his thesis of ethical oil kind of gave it, he let the rat out the bag, as it were, because Ezra Levant advanced the thesis that Canada's oil is ethical oil, that it is wise for the United States to consume Canada's so-called ethical oil as opposed to unethical or what he calls conflict oil coming from states like Venezuela. Of course, Venezuela kicked out the Israeli ambassadors in 2008, 2009, and Iran and other potential hegemons in the Middle East. And so you read Ezra Levant, and I would say Ezra Levant is first and foremost an apologist for Israeli foreign policy and Israel's goals vis-a-vis the Muslim community. That's what he is, at least in a de facto sense.
But I think the only way you can make this work is to destabilize the other oil-producing countries enough that to produce their oil is more expensive than to produce Canadian oil. You have to do that. You have to have a combination because it's too easy for them to produce oil and be competitive in terms of their price. So you have to combine with enticing people to buy Canadian oil, producing Canadian oil, but also creating conditions in the Middle Eastern oil-producing countries where it just becomes impossible or too expensive to produce their oil if you want to achieve this.
Yes, well,
I would think.
Yes. Well, you interviewed James Petrus recently, and I must say I've gleaned a lot of my analyses from his work. And he actually, I believe, went and interviewed oil companies prior to the Iraq War, and asked them, were you for this war in Iraq? Because it became a mantra, thanks to liberal Zionists like Noam Chomsky, that the Iraq War was a war for oil. The assumption was Iraq has oil, therefore this is a war for oil. But Susan Lindau, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Vancouver recently, who's a former CIA agent, she was actually an activist who the CIA came to. She was an anti-sanctions activist, and they said because she knew some of the government of Iraq, as a result of her activism, the CIA came to her and asked her to be an intermediary between the Iraqi government and the U.S. government. And she said Saddam Hussein was on his knees begging the U.S. to basically co-opt him again, said he'd buy 1 million cars a year from the U.S. car industry and so on, because he knew the alternative was to be lynched by these rabid neocons who wanted to balkanize and foment sectarianism in Iraq. And so that's a good example of how the United States, if it was merely pursuing oil interests, would have happily gone and co-opted Saddam Hussein, not had to spend blood and treasure on needless wars of aggression, made itself more unpopular in the Arab world and so on. But yet when we deconstruct who the neoconservatives were, people like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, Richard Pearl, Scooter Libby, Wolfowitz and Feith were investigated for passing classified documents to Israel in the 1980s, and I believe lost their security clearances as a result. And so these were what some have termed Israel firsters, ensconced in the Pentagon and in the highest echelons of power. And as a result, this policy was pursued by the United States post 9/11 of smashing up one of Israel's main adversaries in the Middle East, which is Iraq. And so while in the long run, some oil companies may have jumped on the bandwagon, it's become clear that this policy is actually jeopardizing oil interests in the short term. The same is true for Syria. Suncor has withdrawn from Syria. Many oil companies have been forced to withdraw from Syria, because if you're a plutocrat and I come to you and say, please invest in my oil company, I'm going to Rwanda where there's a nice civil war going on, you'll say, get lost. You're going to take my investment and buy infrastructure that's going to get blown up. And the same is true for Iraq. Oil companies profess disdain for the policy of balkanizing Iraq. If you actually look at what George Bush Sr. said at the time of the first Gulf War, when he was being pleaded with by pro-Israel lobbyists and neoconservatives to take out Saddam Hussein, he refused to do so because he said, I'll create civil war on top of the world's biggest oil field. I'm a representative of the American empire as traditionally conceived as representing big oil. And of course, this goes back to the Eisenhower doctrine of seeking to foment stability in the Middle East rather than instability. And so we see this contradiction within the U.S. ruling class, where one faction is seeking to foment sectarianism and instability in the Middle East because they're basically prioritizing the goal of Israeli hegemony in the Middle East, whereas the traditional U.S. empire builders sought to impose stability on the Middle East by propping up ensconced leaders. Do you know that just in 2001, Iran was offering the United States to collaborate with the goal of fighting the Taliban, because the Taliban are an adversary of the Iranian government. And so people like Zbigniew Brzezinski and traditional American empire builders have drawn attention to the fact that Iran would be an obvious ally of the United States, of Canada and other Western states, if the goal was to create stability in the Middle East. But if the goal is to create, to weaken all of the states of the Middle East, to weaken the states and reduce them to ethno-religious statelets, a kind of patchwork of fiefdoms, so Israel can rule supreme in the Middle East, then the U.S. cozying up with Iran would obviously be antithetical to that goal. And so that I think we have to be aware of the factionalism in the ruling class. And in steps Mr. Harper, who seems to have jumped on the neocon bandwagon, because I think to some extent Stephen Harper's base of support is in Calgary. where he had his riding, of course, in the oil patch. And I do believe that if oil companies are going to find it increasingly difficult due to the sectarianism being encouraged in the Middle East, if the oil companies are going to find it difficult to profit from the oil reserves in the Middle East, they're going to turn to Canada, at least in the short term. It could be in the long run that they've managed to fragment off the oil-rich provinces of these various Middle East states as they balkanize them, and then the oil companies will come back in. But I think at least in the short term, we're going to see oil companies flooding to northern Alberta and despoiling the resources of the indigenous people there.
Mm-hmm. I think it's about time for a first music break. And I'm wondering if we should go towards a Bob Marley song about war, the Bob Marley song about war, or this song, the so-called Harper song. What do you think?
Well, I think we could start with Bob Marley and then segue to the Harper song in the next break.
Okay, so I'm gonna play this, maybe not all of it, and then we'll be right back. So I've been having this discussion with Joshua Blakeney, who will be a regular on the 5 o'clock train every Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. We're gonna play this. Tell us a little bit about how do you feel about this song we're about to play, Joshua?
Well, I think Bob Marley's lyrics in this song are highly apposite for the world we live in, because he has a statement to the effect that until we stop the notion of one race being superior and another one being inferior, we'll have war. Until we stop holding up Israelis as being a superior race over Iranians, Persians, we're going to have war. And we have to not be hypocrites in this, and we can't be Eurocentric on our globalized planet anymore. And so I really think that his words were prescient, and that's why I like this song.
Okay, we'll be right back after this.
Until the philosophy which old one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned. Well, everywhere is war. It's a war. And until there's no longer first class nor second class citizens of any nation, until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance to the color of his eyes, I've got to say war. And until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all without regard to race, it's a war. 'Cause until that day, the dream of lasting peace, world citizenship, and the rule of international morality, will remain but a fleeting illusion to be pursued, but never attained. Well, everywhere is war. It's a war. War in the east, war in the west, war up north, war down south. Yes, this your war, a war. Oh, a rumors of war. Yes, this your war, a war. Oh, rumors of war. And until the ignoble, unhappy regime that hold our brothers in South Africa, anywhere on the part of the earth, in subhuman bondage, has been toppled, utterly destroyed. Well, everywhere is war, everywhere is war. War. Everywhere is war. War. Everywhere.
There's no doubt this drought has been hard on area farmers, but there's one farm you can still count on producing top-quality, fresh organic vegetables. River Glen Farm, located near Carling and Moody in Ottawa's Greenbelt, is open for market 3 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 3 to 7 and Saturdays from 8 to 4. Not only are they stocked with tons of fresh vegetables, you can actually see their garden, chickens, and animals, and you can meet the people who grow your food in this inspiring setting. You can find them on Facebook or check out www.riverglenfarm.ca. That's riverglenfarm.ca. Ever thought about studying abroad? You can meet with universities from around the world offering all kinds of programs and even some scholarships at the Study and Go Abroad Fair on Wednesday, September 26th at the Ottawa Convention Centre. Check out the Travel Pavilion for volunteering or working abroad, language or adventure travel. Doors open at 3, but at 2 you can catch the guest speaker talk about study and work opportunities in France. For more information, go to studyandgoabroad.com.
Hey, we're back. This is the 5 o'clock train. I'm the co-host, Denis Rancourt, and I'm speaking long distance with co-host Joshua Blakeney. And you're listening to 89.1 FM. We're broadcasting from the campus of the University of Ottawa. And Joshua is going to be a regular feature on the show from now on. And that earlier, before the music break there, gave you a taste of what it's going to be like. Welcome back, Joshua.
Thanks for having me back.
And I was thinking we might talk a little bit about these lyrics, which we just heard from this song, War, by Bob Marley. I was thinking, the emphasis is on racism by definition. One race is supposed by this philosophy to be superior to another. And I get a sense that the really big crimes in relation to war are produced not directly as a consequence of racism, I would say, but as a consequence of power structures, hierarchy, the powerful who are able to, on a large scale, with large magnitude, really plunder big time. There's like this driving force, and it's facilitated by war technology. I mean, if you didn't have much stronger side in these conflicts that we're seeing these days, there's always a massively more strong side attacking and destroying some nation to plunder it, to get control of the territory, and so on. So I think that just to this is just me, I'm just throwing it out there, but to say that racism is the origin of this, I would tend to say that racism is augmented in circumstances of tension that are created by hierarchical, dominance. I mean, you can go to so many places in the world where many different races coexist very well. And these in large cities everywhere, everyone's getting along. It's just there isn't war as a result of it. Even if there are different neighborhoods, even if it's integrated or not integrated and so on, there are massive cities all around the world where racism is not a cause of street fights and war and killing and all these horrible things. So I tend to think that racism is something that facilitates in the population of the privileged country that's exercising this imperialism. It's a racism that allows the citizen of those countries not to speak out and to just say, oh well, whatever. That's certainly racism, but that the war itself is really due to this hierarchical want to control and to plunder. I don't know.
I'd agree with that kind of, materialist analysis that, obviously the ideas and the mythology are merely kind of like the superstructure, are products of this kind of economic motive to, loot and pillage the resources that tend to lie under the feet of people who have a darker tan than the people, than, say, the British government. Most of the British government are white men. The Israeli government are Jewish white men invariably, and the Canadian government too. And so obviously, such imperialists, they have to invent mythology, concoct.
But the Russians during the Cold War were white, and they were demonized as much as anybody. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's almost yeah.
But I don't think there was an attempt to colonize Russia at that time. It was merely the fact that Russia had posed a threat to kind of the U.S. hegemony on the planet.
Well, they're colonizing Russia now as we speak. So
yes.
in the end, that was the goal, and it is being realized.
But I think it's obvious that, whenever indigenous peoples seek to assert themselves over their own resources and have economic self-determination, they need to be demonized and vilified. I mean, a good example is you look in like the Declaration of Independence. King George, it's kind of an indictment against King George. And when you get down in the Declaration of Independence, one of the phrases is, he brought on the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is the undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And that was because the British Empire was pursuing a mercantilist policy of trying to stay near the coast, right, and develop the mother country, which led them to have increased alliances with the Indians, which led to our kind of treaty system in Canada. That was the genesis of that treaty system. But these kind of manifest destiny where God's chosen people, individuals ensconced in the 13 colonies, they said, what the hell with all this Wild West that we could colonize and build railroads into and loot? How dare King George, allow the Indians to retain sovereignty over this policy? Because, of course, he actually proposed making an Indian sovereign state called Indiana, right, to act as a kind of buffer because they were interested in furs and so on, which the Indians obviously could capture. And so it's a good example of how in the Declaration of Independence, you see the people who are on the lands and resources that the 13 colonies were seeking to expand into. They had to be demonized and vilified as kind of like terrorists, right? And so it's a similar thing with the war on terror where, obviously the Islamic world have all the resources underneath their feet, and you have to kind of dehumanize and demonize the Islamic world.
Yes,
in order to justify doing genocide and displacing them. But I agree with you in the sense.
Yeah, well, you're adding arguments in the direction that I was critiquing this song. I was saying racism is not the genesis; it's the oppression that's the genesis, and the racism is a feature of that oppression.
Yes, I'd agree with you that it isn't like, people are innately racist and that's the only driving force. Obviously it's complicated. The ideas tend to be forged and created in order to justify the power domination. So I think I'm agreeing with you on that point.
Yeah. Well, I thought, if we're going to play a song, we might as well critique the lyrics.
Yeah. Well, of course, Bob Marley is the one. I always wonder if someone paid Bob Marley to say this. Remember, in one of his songs, he says, "Have no fear for atomic energy," as if, did the nuclear industry pay him to say that?
Right. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it's like we should have fear for atomic energy, right?
I don't know that I'm back to hierarchy, dominance, oppression, exploitation, which is a human thing. It's a human thing, but it's related to how humans organized in this dominant structure. But I think, the hour is flying by, so I think we should get into our next song, which is the Harper song. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I just noticed this on Facebook and sent it to you today, so I haven't really got any analysis of it, but I thought it was quite a good song.
It's the lyrics are brilliant. It's a beautiful song, and I just want to tell our listeners this is not an anti Harper or anti-conservative show by any means. I think we're agreed that it's not conservatism. I think a lot of the problems in the world, in Canada, are due to liberal attitudes and so on. So we're going to be critiquing both sides of the political spectrum in depth. This is not to say that we're setting the tone to be against Harper. We're against his policies. We're against some of his stupidity. And this song is a brilliant critique of the man. So let's listen to that. Do you want to add something to what we're not and what we are?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, I think that, obviously, if we look at what Canadian conservatism traditionally was, it was kind of statist. But anyone who's looked at the statements of David Orchard, who used to lead the Progressive Conservative Party, would know that Canadian conservatism was quite distinct from other forms of conservatism, like the Republican Party in the United States or the Likud Party in Israel represents. And so if you actually look at it, that's why, for example, in Australia, the Liberal Party are actually like the right-wing party because, it goes back to the kind of arguments in the British Empire of mercantilism, which was kind of statist versus free trade, right? And so if you actually look at Canadian Indigenous conservatism, for example, it had more respect for the Indian treaties and did more work for that. I believe the CBC was created by a conservative government. The Trans-Canada Railway, or the railway that goes across Canada, was created by a conservative government. And so people could look at the statements of David Orchard, of course, who was stabbed in the back by the Harper cabal that
yeah. I'm glad you mentioned David Orchard. Where's he gone to? Have you ever interviewed him, or have you tried to? Or
well, my friend and mentor, Professor Anthony Hall, he describes himself as a red Tory, and he's a friend of David Orchard's. And I actually have been on the TV show Face to Face a couple of times, and I noticed that David Orchard was on there, and so I had been hearing about this guy David Orchard for a while, and I watched an hour-long interview with him. It was quite a recent one. And the way he was talking, I mean, it could have just been coming from Hugo Chavez's mouth. He was sort of saying, "Oh, we need a car industry, a state-owned car industry. All the capitalist societies that have been successful have started off with state initiatives." And he was basically arguing for increased statism. And so when people, I know Professor Hall, he gets very frustrated when people call the Harper cabal Tories, because he says, well, they're not really representing what like Canadian Toryism was, which in Professor Hall and other people who call themselves Red Tories view was more kind of socialistic. And
yeah.
As I say,
but David Orchard was also very, very keen on Canada being an independent state, not being a satellite of the U.S. and standing up for itself and so on. He was very keen on that.
Yes, because that's the thing. I mean, if you think about what's the roots, what's the genesis of Canadian conservatism, it's like the loyalists, right? Who came here to distinguish themselves because they didn't go along with the secessionist movement in the British Empire, which formed the United States. And so the Canadian Indigenous conservatism was always defined as, number one, having actually an alliance with the Indians because they fought together in the War of 1812, led by Tecumseh, and also being more kind of statist, trying to do Canadian Indigenous economic projects. And that's why we see David Orchard even today saying we need a state car industry to have, a Canadian car industry and a Canadian railway and a state-owned Canadian airline. It still has that. It still has that kind of Canadian sovereignty.
Here's David Orchard's message to Harper in this song. Let's call it that. Let's play it quickly so we have time to discuss the lyrics after, okay? Here we go.
Steve, it's time to leave. It's time to close the Harper show. Your one-man band has got to go. Time to take a long, long walk in the snow. Steve, it's time to leave. In the good old days we had democracy, but now it's Steve, autocracy, with a daily dose of hypocrisy, spewing from the PMO. There's odors, yes, or know about or not? And where's the bill for all those jails you bought? It's called contempt, and like it or not, you really gotta go. Steve, it's time to leave. It's time for this charade to end. You're running out of rules to bend. You won't get by with a little help from your friends. Steve, it's time to leave. Remember all that campaign spin. Transparency would soon begin. You're in and out, spend and went out and in. Where the sun don't shine. Another slice of Harper's sleeves. A little thing called detainees. You close down the house whenever you please, and you claim to have a spine. Steve.
Hey, Joshua, are you there?
I'm here.
We have to close up. The hour's done.
Oh dear, that went very fast, didn't it?
Yeah.